And the final straw was when an ambassador said, you have to stay in the Human Rights Council because America's the last shred of credibility it has. That was it. I went and met with the president and I said, it's time to get out.
Former Ambassador of the United States to the United Nations, Ambassador Nikki Haley, it's an honor to have you with us on Global Perspectives.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's truly our honor. Ambassador Haley, as I was preparing for this interview, I saw a Haaretz article which headlined 13 times that Nikki Haley stood up for Israel in the United Nations. And your track record in the UN is really incredible for many in the pro-Israel community. At the United Nations, you also, with the Trump administration, pulled out of the United Nations Human Rights Council. And while you did that, you called out the council for the body's hypocrisy and their mockery of human rights. Let me ask you this question. You are truly a stalwart supporter of the Jewish state of Israel. Why?
You know, it's interesting because I have said that the Human Rights Council is a cesspool of political bias, but they proved it. We didn't pull out of the Human Rights Council right away. We really wanted to see if we could find ways to correct it. And so we asked for two things. We said, one, we want to make sure that we start vetting the people that sit on the council, start vetting their records. You know, why is it that we have China and Russia and Cuba and Democratic Republic of Congo sitting on there? We should start vetting those. And then the second thing is they had one agenda item just for Israel that allowed them to bash Israel over and over again. No other country has an agenda item solely to them. Not Syria, not Iran, all of these countries, none of them. And so we said, get rid of agenda item 7 and let's start clearing up the, who gets on the council. Looking at that, we talked to over 100 countries. They all agreed that the council was a farce. They all agreed that it was embarrassing in private, but none of them would step up. And the final straw was when an ambassador said, you have to stay in the Human Rights Council because America's the last shred of credibility it has. That was it. I went and met with the president and I said, it's time to get out. And we got out and we never looked back. And I think it's terrible that President Biden's looking to get back in.
Well, your leadership was certainly bold, and I think it is really disheartening for many of us to see the Biden administration reversing so many successful Trump administration policies at the UN specifically. And also, if I can stay on the UN for a moment, the United States also during your term and under your leadership chose to defund the UN refugee agency, the UNRWA, which part of the claim that they make is that there's over 5 million plus Palestinian refugees. And at the time you made a statement and you said that our findings were that's closer to 500,000. Could you tell our audience the significance of that?
Well, UNRWA is the type of organization where they claim that they have, their refugees are everywhere and they claim they're in the millions and they go and they have, terrible things in textbooks about Israelis and they continue to overspend and they're corrupt. And so what we said was, look, you need to reform on multiple levels. We need to look at exactly what number you have of refugees. We need you to clean the textbooks. We need to see how you're spending. And all they did was just poor mouth. And they would always come back and say, no, we need money. If you don't give us money, the schools would close. Well, that's when I went to President Trump and I said, don't give them the money. They poor mouth every time and never have the schools closed? And why aren't the Arab countries paying for this? Why is the United States giving what had already been $6 billion to UNRWA? And we didn't give the money. We gave half against my advice. We gave half. And they still protested us in the streets. And that was all we needed to know. They didn't want to change. They wanted to continue doing whatever it took to continue to have money coming into UNRWA. And, when you have those organizations that are a farce like that, you have to call them out for what they are. But the last thing America needs to be doing is funding them. And so that's why we got out of it.
Well, you just mentioned your advice to the president, and one of the key items that you're credited with advising President Trump was really advising him to pull out of the disastrous Iran 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal, which many perceive as one of the most important foreign policy decisions of the entire Trump administration. Ambassador Haley, can you tell us a little bit about that and your thoughts on how the Biden administration should be proceeding with the Iranian regime right now?
Well, I think we saw that, what was happening in the Iran deal, it wasn't working. The Obama administration may have been well-intended to get into it in the first place, but the right thing to do was to say, is what we got ourselves into really working? And it wasn't. Iran was in multiple violations, whether it was selling arms to terrorists, whether it was testing ballistic missiles, whether it was supporting terrorism. And we knew that America was less safe with this deal. But I told the president, I said, let me go to Vienna. Let me meet with the IAEA and see how they're verifying what is happening with Iran. And the president allowed me to do that. And when I went, I asked them a couple of questions. I said, okay, we know a lot's happening in the military installations. When was the last time you inspected them? And they said, we're not allowed to inspect military installations. And I said, well, we know a lot of the research happens in the universities. When was the last time you inspected the universities? They said, we're not allowed to inspect the universities. And so then I said, okay, well, when do you inspect and what do you inspect? And they said, if we see something suspicious, then we give them 45 days notice, and then we inspect. I mean, there was no reason for us to stay in that deal. There were no teeth to it. And so I came back and I made the case to the American public. I made the case to the president. He wanted to get out of the Iran deal, and so it was the perfect opportunity to do that. So the idea that Biden is falling all over himself to get back into it is doing nothing but making the world less safe. And I think that Israel needs to stand up and say, this is not good for us. But the Arab community doesn't want to see this happen either. And so really the only way that we're going to see any progress with Iran is not caving and releasing the sanctions on them, understanding that people will always see the Iran deal as Obama's deal. And if there is any deal to be made with Iran, only when you bring in the Arab community and the Europeans and the Americans to truly hold Iran accountable, then do you consider a deal. But we shouldn't be loosening any strings. We shouldn't be giving them any money. And if Biden chooses to give them hundreds of millions of dollars again, all they're going to do is funnel that to the Houthis and to Hezbollah and to Hamas, and that's exactly what we shouldn't be doing.
And the Iranians have proven to us over and again that that is exactly what they do with U.S. and other sanctions relief dollars. You also just wrote an op-ed about China and Iran. What were you suggesting in your op-ed that the U.S. Congress should be doing?
Well, we put sanctions on Iran, and the goal of putting sanctions on Iran was we knew if we stopped the funding, we were stopping the funding of bad activity that was happening. We were stopping the funding of nuclear production. Well, there is money flowing to Iran, and if you go and you look, why is it that they're getting revenues? They're getting it from China. China is exporting oil from Iran, which is in violation of our sanctions. No one is saying anything. No one is calling them out on that, and it's a real problem for us. And I think that we have to hold China accountable. I think what we're seeing now is China, whereas they wouldn't have supported Iran a few years ago, they are very comfortable supporting any enemy to the United States. And we have to start doing something about that.
I think we couldn't agree with you more, Ambassador Haley, and you're someone who certainly you're forthright. You speak your mind. We just heard an incredible speech upstairs at the Republican Jewish Coalition Convention. Standing ovation. The crowd really was falling over for you. And in part of your speech, you also spoke a bit about the AIPAC policy conference, and you said that in their effort to be bipartisan, you feel sometimes perhaps they're losing focus of their mission in the first place. What's your thinking about what you think AIPAC and the Jewish community should be doing on these issues that we just discussed, Israel, Iran, and so on?
Well, I love AIPAC, and AIPAC has always been incredibly supportive of everything that I've done. But I care about the future of AIPAC. I care about the future of any organization that's really trying to push good and truth. I've said this to their leadership for a long time. You can't have these elected officials who support the Iran deal, who support the BDS movement, who aren't helping with the Israeli-U.S. relationship, and have them come sit on a stage with thousands of people. You're rewarding bad behavior, and that's exactly what's going to get you more bad behavior. And so what I want to see AIPAC do is, whether it's Republican or Democrat, we want the Israel situation to always be bipartisan. I want as many Democrats to support Israel as Republicans. So if there's someone that does support the things that will keep Israel strong, have them on the stage, but you've got to stop having these bad actors on the stage, because all you're doing is rewarding them for bad behavior. And I hope AIPAC sees that, because when you have a mission to do something, you lose that mission if all you're doing is trying to appease other people and you lose sight of actually accomplishing the goal.
Well, I know certainly after your remarks that the conversation is definitely going to start across the Jewish world on this topic. Ambassador Haley, I know your time is tight, and I have one last question for you. You know, as a woman who had the honor and privilege of serving our country, unfortunately did not overlap with your term in office, you are truly a role model for women everywhere, in diplomacy, in politics, in government, in elected office. What is your advice for women who want to go into these fields?
We need you. You know, we need more women involved. I'm a big fan of women. I think we have an amazing ability to prioritize. I think we have an amazing way of looking at details and really understanding what the goals are. And I'll tell you, we need more women there. There's a reason Margaret Thatcher said, if you want something said, ask a man. If you want something done, ask a woman. And so I thank you for your service. And it's rewarding. It's something that makes our country, makes our world better, makes a better life for our children. It's what we should be doing, is stepping out a little bit more to say, how do we help our families, how do we help our neighbors, and how do we help our communities? And so I hope we continue to see a lot of strong women get involved.
Well, Ambassador Haley, your service to our country has been so incredible to date, and we are all awaiting your continued service. We're so grateful to you for everything that you do for the United States, for Israel, for the Jewish people.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.